Hi, and welcome back to the Milvet Podcast. I'm your host, Brendan Aronson. Today, I'm joined by Gerta Malai. I'm excited to dive into today's conversation with Gerta about a really important topic, which is compensation negotiation. Gerta is a veteran spouse. She's the founder of yournegotiations.com. She has a master's in engineering from MIT, which is obviously no big deal. And she's also an expert in negotiating compensation. She's been helping folks negotiate for better compensation. She's been helping startups negotiate with their investors, suppliers, etc. Her career spans work at enterprise companies like IBM. She's worked in biotech at Sanofi, which is a global biotech company. She's also a startup founder, angel investor, and advisor. I'm so excited to dive in today. Thanks for joining us, Gerta.
Thanks for having me.
Gerta, I've given like a 30,000 foot overview of your background, but it's always really helpful to hear it in the first person. So can you take a few minutes to tell us about yourself?
Yeah, thank you for that intro. As you said, I'm a negotiations expert. I was trained by world-class experts at MIT and from Harvard Law School, and I'm the founder and CEO of yournegotiations.com. My negotiations philosophy, it incorporates different channels. One is that I'm originally from Albania, which is a very hustle culture country. You always have to advocate for yourself. There's the training piece at MIT, and then there's also my personal passion for behavioral sciences, which all of those things I incorporate into the negotiation philosophy that I train my clients on.
That's awesome. So how did you get into this work? I mean, what was it about negotiations that caught, your attention? And then how did you come up with kind of like building a business around this?
It's been a passion of mine for a long time, probably decades. And over the years, my friends and family and their friends and family would reach out like, hey, I have an offer. Can you help me negotiate? Or I'm negotiating my rent or health insurance claims and things like that. And so my reputation spread across my network. And this year, as I was trying to figure out my next move after having left a startup that I co-founded, as you may have heard, there were a lot of tech layoffs. And one of my connections who was laid off from Meta, she said, hey, there's a Meta Facebook group of people who have been laid off, and they always ask questions on negotiations. Is there something you would be open to organizing and sharing your knowledge? I'm like, yeah, of course. And there was so much interest, like hundreds of people showed interest. And from there, I realized maybe this should be a business and how can I scale myself? So I do one-on-one negotiations consulting, but I also do courses, whether live or async. And I'm writing a book on negotiations and just trying to build a business around it.
Super cool. Negotiations are interesting. So for our audience, you also have a connection to a military veteran. I know that to be true. So, I mean, in our background, we don't negotiate comp. Needs of the Marine Corps is the negotiation. That's what we were taught in the Marines. It's like, we're going to send you where we're going to send you, and you just show up. I guess just to start, can you tell us a little bit about, like, have you worked with a number of veterans in negotiating their compensation, or what's it been like just kind of seeing compensation negotiations through the veteran in your own life?
Yeah, that's a great question that I love answering. So my husband was in the Air Force and he's a veteran now, and he made the transition from the Air Force into tech. He was in product marketing at Instagram and then some high growth, smaller startups. So I've learned so much about the military mindset and values through him, as well as seeing obviously the dedication and discipline that military veterans and members have that they bring into the outside world. But I've also seen some of the challenges. So one thing he always mentions is the value of service before self, and how you need to put obviously your country and the military above yourself, and you take what's given. And the US military is very generous with their benefits. I fully understand that principle. But in the business world, you actually need to advocate for yourself a lot more. The quote that I like to mention is, you don't get what you deserve. In the business world, you don't get what you deserve, you get what you negotiate. And that's just the principle we're all operating under. And that's the biggest mindset shift that I recommend for veterans.
How do you encourage people to advocate for themselves? This is something that I have a lot of challenge doing, and we spend a lot of time telling transitioning veterans to advocate for themselves, especially in an interview. Like, you have to be selling yourself in an interview. How do you encourage people to think about advocating for themselves?
There are a couple of thoughts that I have. One is that if you don't advocate for yourself, you're leaving money on the table. There is this concept in negotiations, which we call expanding the pie. So it's not a zero-sum game. It's a common misconception about negotiations. It's not if I get more, you get less, but it's more about let's be creative together. Me as a job applicant and you as a, let's say, an employer. How can we be creative where we can end up in both in a win-win situation where we both gain more than our initial offer? And so that is one thing that I think is helpful. So just think of it as a collaborative process where we both get a better outcome. That's what makes this very exciting for me personally. The other piece is, I know this more on the sort of the gender side. So women do get penalized for negotiating or coming across as aggressive during negotiations. And one thing that actually works really well and resonates with employers is if you negotiate on behalf of other people, for example, your family. So even if at least you keep that in the back of your mind, like if I'm leaving money on the table, I'm actually not bringing that home to my family. That might help, even if you don't mention that in negotiations, it might help with your mindset.
Huge upgrade for the mindset. I
Yep.
always encourage people to think about like the other mouths, right? Because I think it's really hard to advocate for yourself sometimes, but it's so much less challenging to advocate for a partner or someone that you really care about. That's really good advice. So grow the pie first, and then second, pick someone else to negotiate on their behalf.
Yes.
And obviously you're negotiating for yourself, but you're doing kind of by, with, and through yourself for that other person.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. Can you help us understand some of the basics of negotiation? If we've never been in a negotiation before, what are some of the basic principles that we need to think about?
Yeah, let's see. Well, first, again, this is more on the sort of white collar type of jobs. So first, you want to think of the negotiation as an entire process. In a job offer, you have more leverage or less leverage across the timeline. The highest leverage you can have timeline wise is when you get a written offer. And that's because at the written offer stage, you know that, well, first for an open role, there's only one written offer that goes out because you sign and now you're employed. So they had to go through all the approvals, all the interviews, all the alignments to be able to now extend your written offer. And that's how you know that you're the chosen applicant. And that's the point in the entire interview process where you have the most leverage. So that's one thing to keep in mind. More specifically, I recommend not negotiating before the written offer stage. Now, you will be pressured to negotiate before then, especially at the verbal offer stage, but I strongly recommend staying strong and pushing for the written offer and then only negotiating at that point. So that's one principle I recommend. The other one is I do hear some negotiations coaches have some misleading guidance, which is lying about having another offer. Now, having another offer is definitely one of the best things you could have to leverage to get more comp with the initial offer, but I strongly recommend against lying. It's unethical, and I'm sure the veteran community already knows that and is already on board with that. And also recruiters and companies are really good at telling if you're lying about that. There's a lot of micro expressions that give away whether you do have another offer or not. The other piece is, again, there's some misguidance around playing hard to get. It will show that you're so desirable in the market and things like that. I would not recommend playing hard to get. You want to show so much excitement about the company, the team, the role, the hiring manager. The mindset needs to be, I would take this offer if the compensation was a little higher or title or whatever is important to you, rather than I'm not very invested in this. What do you have to offer more? So just being very professional and nice throughout the process is very key.
Awesome. I want to kind of double click on some of these. So you kind of broke down three basics of negotiation, and I'll add in a fourth when we get to it. But first is the timing of negotiating. So when is it appropriate to negotiate? So maybe we can just kind of zoom back out for folks. For some folks, it might be like their first time approaching getting a civilian job, and kind of talk through the timeline of how an interview process works. Do you mind giving us just like a high level overview of like what a timeline might look like and when compensation negotiation should be kind of in the back of your mind and when it should be brought up?
Yeah, that's a great point. So a typical negotiation starts on the first call with the recruiter, where they'll either ask you how you feel about the salary range that they've shared on the job post, or they'll give you a number and they say, how do you react to that? Or they'll ask you for your preferred salary. And the reason there are different versions of this is because in certain states in the US, such as California and New York, they're required by law to reveal a salary range for a job. And so that's the first negotiation move, where you need to be prepared what to say and what not to say. Sometimes actually the negotiation starts even earlier. If you're applying online, there might be a form that asks you, what is your preferred salary range? That too is a negotiation move that you need to be prepared for. Beyond that, we have throughout the interview process, if it's a smaller startup, they could ask you during the interviews still about your expectations if you haven't really answered earlier. If it's a bigger company, most likely you will not be asked during the interviews. One thing to keep in mind is you don't want to proactively reveal any personal information during the interviews. Things like maybe your marital status or any like family planning, or if you want to move around or anything like that. Don't share information that could potentially hurt you in the negotiation process. And then after the interviews, the next big point in the job application is the verbal offer. That's when you will most likely be really pressured to either react to their offer and say yes or no, or to give a counter offer. That's actually one of the toughest in this environment this year, with all the layoffs and with all the economy in the state that it is. That's the toughest negotiation that I've seen. And then you go to the written offer. That's when I recommend you negotiate, and you do some back and forth multiple times, and then you sign and you're done. So that's basically the timeline.
Awesome. I want to provide like my own perspective on this. Our company, the way that we work, we headhunt for open roles. We have a bunch of clients that we work with, and then we help them find the best candidates for their open roles. And so we've helped candidates negotiate their comp. We've helped clients negotiate with candidates. We try and serve as an intermediary. Sometimes a client will ask us to kind of like get out of the way. They just want to do it themselves, which I think makes a ton of sense because it's a relationship that the two parties will have with one another after we're gone. Or they'll ask for us to help them understand on the early innings, like what is the comp range that would make sense for this role if they're very early in thinking about a role, or do we think that we can close a candidate at a certain comp range? And so from my perspective, we've helped employers think through what kinds of comp ranges make sense for people. And so I want to walk through that same timeline from the perspective of a recruiter, and I'm curious to hear kind of your thoughts and reactions to it. Mm-hmm. So first, I think, you mentioned the early stages of the interview process, which includes oftentimes a job will have a salary range posted online. It's legally required in certain states, as you mentioned. And so it's really important to only be applying for roles for which the range is something that you find acceptable. Sometimes an employer may have some flexibility, but I really wouldn't count on it. I would think that stated range is where they want to end up. And so there's a process of self-selecting out if the compensation range is too far off. That's kind of the first time I see it come into play. The second time, when we do screening calls with candidates, we ask them about their goals for compensation. It is actually illegal for an employer to ask for what is your current compensation. Yep. That's an illegal question. So people will not ask, or they should not ask in an interview, like, what is your compensation? What is your salary right now? Those are not legal questions, and you don't have to answer them. And nor should you necessarily volunteer that information. People do volunteer it all the time in those initial screens, which I find a little bit surprising.
I have to, yeah.
Let's just pause there. I'm kind of curious to hear your thoughts around like, why would someone not reveal their current salary level?
That's a great question. So the fact that it's against the law in certain states to ask for your current salary or your last salary if you're laid off is because we don't want like new employers that are trying to hire you to base their salary off of your last one. It should be whatever the role is requiring, whatever the budget the company has. If the next employer can afford a 2x salary than your last one, why not have that? So the fact that this law is in place, people have had to advocate and are looking out for job applicants to not give away that leverage so that you can have the chance of having a much higher compensation at a new role. And that's why I think people should really be careful not to reveal their current salary or past salary, to not give away that leverage. Now, I do see people revealing that. I've been on the interviewer side and people have proactively offered it. I think the reason why people do reveal it is to show that I'm so collaborative, I'm so transparent. I get that, but honestly, you will probably not get any bonus points for revealing that. You're just kind of shooting yourself in the foot. You're also, there is not much of an upside and there's a lot of downside. A company, depending on the role, wants to see that you have good business acumen and you have good business sense. And by you already showing your hand, I, as an interviewer, would not have much faith that you would know how to advocate for me to your like clients or users and things like that when you're an employee, if you do get the job. So I do want people to think about negotiations as this is a good skill that I'm showing that I have in the interview stage, and I'm going to bring this into the role as well. And I'll advocate for the company when the time comes.
Yeah, and I mean, from my perspective, I do find it helpful and collaborative when people do share it. And I think one of the reasons that people do so is because you're putting a valuation on something that is very illiquid, right? And by that, for folks that have been in the business world for less time, like a liquid asset is something that's priced regularly. So the stock market is a liquid asset. People buy and trade and transact in stocks. And so there's a value assigned to it that everybody kind of agrees on. But for certain other assets, like say you're a startup that's fundraising and it's a very illiquid investment, it's not going to materialize for 10 years. Or compensation, like you only go on the market every few years, it's much more challenging to assign a value to that. The other thing that makes this complicated is like you're trying to assign an employer should be willing to compensate you for the value that you create for the business, mm-hmm. which is also difficult to project. It's difficult to forecast. And so there are kind of like all these different things that add complexity to it. But I guess the quick takeaway is like, you don't have to reveal your current salary numbers. Mm-hmm. You're not required to. How do you advise candidates to answer the question, what are your goals around compensation? Because it is like kosher for a recruiter or someone to ask for what you would like to be making in your next role.
Yeah, it's totally fair for a recruiter to ask, what are your salary expectations or total comp expectations? I generally advise for job applicants to not reveal to not reveal a number, because it's exactly what you said. It's not a very easy thing to measure the value you'll bring to the company, or, you know, how much a specific role needs to pay exactly down to the dollar. Another thing that ties into this is that not only there's a market, of course, for example, let's say product managers in company size of, mid-sized companies in whatever city, there is a market that shows the supply and demand of that. But on the other hand, there are internal reasons at a company why they would be willing to pay more. So it could be that they might want to fill this role as soon as possible because they have a product launch, or the team is burnt out and they're short staffed, so now they need to fill this role, or they want to impress investors or whatever. So there might be reasons internally that you can never know as an applicant that makes them want to pay more. And that's why that's why it's not as simple as, I want to make, I don't know, 200K. Oh, okay, yeah, we'll give you that. It's more like, let's sort of dance around this to figure out a place where we both get a win, but are not fully revealing our hand.
Yeah. And for folks that are interacting with us as recruiters, I would say like, we do need to confirm that the compensation range works. And so you don't have to give us like a firm answer of like, this is a number that I will say yes to, but we do need to know, like, are we in the ballpark? Because like, if I have a client that's willing to pay 200K in cash and, maybe 250 all in cash comp, sometimes people will use OTE, on target earnings. Mm-hmm. But if they're willing to pay 250K in all in cash comp and you're expecting 400K, it's just not really worth the conversation on either party's side, because it's just not in the cards. And so we do want to confirm that folks are within the range, or that an offer that was in that range would work for the candidate before we move forward. And then we get into the interview process. So we go through, and during the interview process, you're selling yourself. You're convincing an employer about the value that you can add to their organization. And then we get down to this verbal and written offer stage. Now, I'm going to push back a little bit on what you said. You said never to negotiate on the verbal offer stage. Yeah. And I am a recruiter, so, hold me accountable here, I guess. But we do have clients for whom they want to know that when they make a written offer that it's going to be accepted. And they a lot of times will view the negotiation portion of the process as during the verbal stage, because and especially for earlier stage companies that maybe have to go, have a lawyer look over an employment agreement or something like that. It's just like they want the relationship to start on the right foot. So I'm curious to hear when you would ever flex or bend on your insistence that you wait for a written offer in order to negotiate the compensation.
I totally get your side of this as the recruiter, as the employer side. So the happy path, as we call it in tech, for the employer side is we negotiate at the verbal stage before there's a written offer where I need to do some more alignment with leadership. And then it makes my life so much easier. We go to the written stage and you sign and we're done. But I think more objectively for the job applicant, the reality is that once you've extended me the written offer, that means you are more locked into this offer and you have signaled that I am the favorite candidate of all the other ones. And you are more willing, a little bit more willing than you normally would be to give me what I want. And so objectively, I think that for the candidate, it is best to negotiate at the written offer stage. Now, I don't want to make your life harder. I
Killing me
hope
here.
don't erase this part of the podcast.
Oh, well. No,
um,
we'll leave it in, of course. For people that are listening to the audio only version, we're like looking back and forth and smiling and laughing because yeah, I mean, we are managing client expectations, and when they are getting ready to move to that stage, I have had an experience where a candidate waited until the written offer and then started negotiating, and then the employer was like, "I thought we ironed all this out. Like, why are we doing this at this point?" And so that's obviously like not a perfect way to start a relationship. But we'll also draw out that this is different depending upon the stage of the company as well. And so, like, if you're negotiating with like Meta or like a massive tech company or something like that, where it's like the recruiters are facilitating, but the person that's hiring you is the person that you're going to be working with, then oftentimes it does kind of help to like have that intermediary who's like, okay, this is just like part of my job, and I'm going to go back to the compensation people and make sure that there's like budget aligned to this, and we can get you what you need. But if it's a smaller employer where you're negotiating with the person that you're going to work with directly, sometimes I think it can be a little bit trickier. And ultimately, I feel like you would agree with this. Probably like the most important framework for a negotiation is to make sure that you're going to approach it from a good faith perspective, and that both parties are going to maintain a great relationship going forward. Like, nothing that we say on this podcast is going to supersede the advice of like, make sure that no matter what, you are maintaining a fantastic relationship with a counterparty.
Definitely. I want to clarify that in case there were misunderstandings, I am not saying you should say yes the entire way and then you get to the written offer and now you negotiate. But you want to play it in such a way that you're like, you say, I would love to see the written offer, the entire package in writing so that, I can discuss with my family and I can take another look or compare it to my other offers. So something along those lines. You're not saying yes and then changing your mind. That's, pretty unethical, and it damages the relationship. So, and fully agree with you. The relationship should come above everything else, especially since ultimately it might also affect whether you get the offer or not. On the other hand, I want to offer this perspective, which is I have had clients negotiate at the verbal offer stage because they're so convinced that's when you negotiate. And then the company is not as invested, and then it never moves to the written offer stage, or the verbal offer is rescinded. Most likely, it just kind of never moves to the written offer stage. So that's the trick and the sort of drawback of negotiating at the potential drawback of negotiating at the verbal offer stage.
This is why we brought you on the podcast, is because it gives a different perspective. Like, I can advise people on one perspective, but it is really helpful to get an outside perspective. So
I appreciate that.
yeah, and we will not edit this out, I promise.
We'll see.
Or if we do, we'll edit out the part where we talk about editing it out. So
Okay.
jokes aside, so the second thing that you advised us of in basics of negotiation is this idea of FOMO. You said never to lie about a competing offer. Obviously, that's like fantastic advice. I don't really think we need to linger here too long. If an employer finds out that you're lying at any stage of the interview process, they're obviously not going to move forward. And so make sure to never do that. But this concept of FOMO, can you talk a little bit about what is FOMO and how do people think about it in terms of a negotiation?
Yeah, so the reason why I say not to lie about another offer is because having another offer is one of the best things, if not the best thing you can do for your negotiation power and leverage. That's why some people, some coaches out there might advise you to lie because it has so much power. But again, we already established you don't do that. What I do advise instead is to go out there and get another offer. And I'm sure people right now think like, oh, as if I didn't want two offers. But what I mean is get another offer, even if you're not super excited about it. One is it will work, it will do wonders for your first negotiation with the first company. And two is you would be surprised how much you might like the second offer. This has actually happened to someone very close to me. I advised them to get another offer, and they ended up loving that offer more than the initial one and just went with that second company. So those are some tips around, I guess, the FOMO aspect you touched on.
Yeah, there's a few things at play here when you talk about FOMO. We see it all the time as VC investors when we have a startup that pitches you and they're not raising capital. Nobody's ever raising capital until, they have a term sheet. And then it's very, and I've done this on the fundraising side. I've done this as a founder where I'm negotiating and like everybody's like, yeah, sounds really interesting. Keep me up to date. And then once you have a term sheet, the conversation very much changes because it's like, hey, I've got this other offer in hand now. And so there is nothing more powerful to get a counterparty to a yes or a no than having another offer. And that's true in compensation negotiations. It's true in any kind of business negotiations. So having another offer in hand does a few things for you. First, it accelerates the timeline and gets someone to a yes or a no quickly. And the worst thing that someone can say in a business negotiation is maybe, because maybe makes you commit more time and resources to a process. It's just better to have a no and to know that it's a no and move on. So having another offer can get you to that yes or no more quickly. The other thing that it does is this concept of mimetic desire. Have you read this book, Wanting, by what's his name, like Luke Burgess or something like that?
I've read about mimetic desire from Gerard. I forget his full name, but yes, I'm very familiar with the concept.
So I read the first 10 or 15 pages of this book, so I'm pretty much an expert in it. And yeah, I mean, mimetic desire is this concept that everybody wants what other people want, or that we kind of look to the crowd for like reassurance in uncertain situations. And so having another offer is like a feather in your cap as a potential employee to say like, hey, like I am desired in the workforce. Like someone else is like values what I can add to their organization. And so that can psychologically be helpful for an employer to be like, okay, cool. Like we know that this is a desirable candidate. Like more people than just us are seeing positive traits here. So mimetic desire can also be really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. When you say as a job applicant, hey, I actually have another offer, can we either expedite the process or, can you come up on comp if you're after the offer stage? Actually, for many companies, there are new mechanisms that unlock in the back end where they can now potentially give you more money than they would have initially given you, regardless of your negotiations tactics. So one example I see is, for example, for grad school graduates. So let's say MBA graduates, when they go and apply to tech companies, this is the area I'm most familiar with. Tech companies will say, hey, we actually give the exact same offer to all the graduates just to keep things pretty equal across the board. However, I have noticed that recruiters will ask, as you're negotiating, whether you have another offer, and which signals that they would be willing to throw in a bit more money if you have another offer. So even when it is very even across the board, I've actually also helped a lawyer negotiate their contract, which lawyers too have, very standard levels within the same firm. They pay people according to their seniority. We were able to negotiate a sign-on bonus, and their sign-on bonuses are huge in the six figures because this lawyer had another offer. So it does open new mechanisms for a company to give you more.
Yeah, and also to accelerate the timeline too. And so all good things. So having another offer in hand, very, very helpful. Another principle that you mentioned was having excitement throughout the interview process. It's so important. I mean, this is like interview 101. Show excitement for your employer, bring like your A self and go into these conversations. I always tell candidates like the best advice I feel like I give people, which is it's also the dumbest advice on the planet, is like put your shoulders back, sit up straight, smile. And like that alone will prime you to go into these conversations with some excitement. Curious to hear how you advise candidates, whether it's through the lens of negotiation or just interviews more generally, about maintaining excitement throughout the interview process.
Yeah, so as we all probably know, we say that in an interview process, everything is an interview. For example, even interacting with the front desk person, with assistants or anything like that, like even though it's not an official interview where they're asking you questions, you are being interviewed. And similarly for negotiations, every interaction is kind of part of the negotiation. To tie the dots between, point A and point B, you will probably not get an offer if they don't see that you're excited about this. People want to work with people who are excited about the work, the company, the team, and the product, whatever is relevant. And there is a chance that if you're kind of playing hard to get or playing it cool or anything like that, they might favor, all else equal, they might favor someone who is more excited about it, because jobs have ups and downs and they want someone who will stay for the entire journey.
Yeah, that's fantastic advice. I really appreciate you reinforcing that. I mean, I just want to like double click one time just because it is really important. Everything in the interview process is an interview. Never, ever let your guard down until you have that written offer and you've signed it. Even after that, like frankly, there's just like a degree of professionalism that should be expected in a working relationship. But I have had candidates who get really comfortable in the interview process. They're crushing it. They're gelling with the team. And then they'll say something stupid that they don't really, it doesn't represent them in the best possible way. And then it's like, I mean, this is an interview, and the potential offer is gone.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, it's great advice. Please go ahead.
Yeah, and sorry to I interrupted you. Go ahead.
No. It's better. The more you talk, the less I talk, the better. Go ahead.
To tie this back to negotiations, you might have a casual conversation with someone from the team and they ask like, oh, what are you doing for vacation or whatever? And like, oh, I would love to move to across the country. That might affect the offer if the company is fully in person or anything like that. So be very careful what you're revealing about your personal life or personal preferences that might make you less of a desirable candidate.
Okay, cool. I want to add some additional negotiations principles. And so I took a negotiations class at Wharton, and I think the one thing that really stuck in my mind was this idea of a BATNA, the best alternative to a negotiated arrangement. Can you tell us a little bit about a BATNA and how it might come into play as it pertains to compensation negotiation?
Yeah, so think of BATNA as like, what would you do if you didn't take this offer? Like, what is your best alternative to this offer? And this is a very personal decision. So I have clients, many of my clients are in the tech industry, especially in FANG. And so they have certain criteria, like I will not take a job with a lower title than I had at my last company. So that's their walking away point. Let's say the job offer comes in. This is actually happening a lot this year. People are being under-leveled and underpaid in their offers all the time. It's a little discouraging, but it's the economy as well. So it might be your walking away point, like I will not take a job with a lower title than my last job, or I will not take a job with a lower pay than my last job, things like that. That's a very personal decision. Other people would make a different decision, but it's very good to be very crystal clear on that, because it will inform your negotiation strategy and how you play it. So for example, if you do have a walk away point, whether in title or in pay, you want to negotiate that upfront and as soon as possible, because it's a non-negotiable for you. You don't want to wait until you've negotiated different items and then all of a sudden you disagree on the title and you've both wasted so much time. I do advise this to all my clients and all my audience to, before you start negotiating, be very clear on your priorities in order of importance, and especially the non-negotiables, and have that inform your negotiation strategy, because otherwise you would at minimum waste a lot of time and effort.
Super helpful. And so the BATNA specifically is this best alternative to a negotiated arrangement. You do not have to tell you do not tell the counterparty your BATNA. You don't have to say like, oh, like I will walk, your BATNA is for you to be able to like index off of and go into the negotiation. But just to reiterate the point, like your amount of leverage is directly dependent upon your BATNA. So if you're unemployed and you're a month from running out of cash and you've got like kids to feed, you have like a lower threshold for being able to negotiate this. And when you get to an offer and you're like, you know what, like I got to put food on the table. There's a good offer. I'm taking it.
Yeah.
That's very different than if you're passive talent. You already have a job that you really like. You're on a team that really values you. You're adding a ton of value. You're personally fulfilled. And then someone comes and bats their eyes at you, a new employer, and they say, we'd be interested in having you on the team. You've got a very high baton at that point, and then they're going to need to really make it worthwhile for you to take on the additional risk of moving to a new team, a new role, etc. So
Yeah,
having an idea
absolutely.
of that baton is really important.
I still think it's a very personal decision. Even someone who, has a family, there are people who will rather tap into their savings rather than take lower title. So it does come down to your own very personal priorities. And yes, like you said, definitely do not share. So the way to think about negotiations, one framework is thinking of it almost as a card game. You can't win the game if you reveal your cards. So things like BATNA, your priorities, your non-negotiables. If you do have another offer, what company it is, what size, what industry, what location, all of that, it's highly recommend not sharing because it's like revealing your cards and it's harder to win. And again, a win can still be a win-win. It's not a zero-sum game, but it's still you want to win.
For sure. The last basics of negotiation to cover, I think, is, again, we've actually kind of already alluded to this, but what you should be indexing off of, hopefully, is the value that you provide. And so I see it in terms of like when we're making sales, like when we're selling things to a potential customer, right? You might have something that costs you X amount of money to produce, but what you're really indexing on when you're putting a price on something is the value that's provided to the counterparty. So I think that like little framing is actually really helpful because some people will like, a tchotchke that's on my desk. I've got this little like time tracker thing, right? And I'm sure this thing costs like 50 cents to produce. It's like very cheap, plastic, etc. But the value that it provides to someone when it's in this form is very different. Now it's $60 a month or something like that, right? Because it's like, hey, we are helping you understand how you're spending your time, which is your most valuable resource. So I think thinking about the value that you provide to an employer is also a helpful framework going into a negotiation. I'm curious to hear if you have any kind of thoughts on that.
Yeah, definitely. The way I recommend people structure their negotiation move, and I'm giving away some of the secret sauce, is I'm very excited about the offer, the company, the role, the team, anything that's relevant, the product. I do think I can bring a lot to the table. Here are 3 things I can bring to the table. And I'm very excited to learn from the team and the hiring manager. So you do want to remind them what's in it for them. And we say that a lot in business, even in presentation. Why should I care, or what's in it for me? What's the why? That's a great point you mentioned, especially since some people might frame it more like, I need more money because I'm about to buy a house. Like that's not a good argument to give
Terrible.
an employer that like, that's not my problem. I pay for the value that you bring into the job.
Yeah, that's really well said. So this idea of like framing, even if you're deep in the interview process, someone understands the value that you bring. When it comes to negotiating compensation, I would just remind them again. Like I would just be like, hey, remember, this is the value that I'm bringing to you. And so this number that we're talking about here, this is what's going to be meaningful to me. But again, leading with that, this is the value. And Gerta also made a bit of a nuanced point, but it's a really important one. You always want to frame it in terms of the other person, like true of all things in life, but especially true in terms of negotiating compensation and potential job employment or opportunities, is like, what is in it for them? Like, hey, this is why I'm adding value to your team. I'm going to make all of your headaches disappear. I'm going to fix these problems. Here are some like easy ways I can add a ton of value. And by the way, I think that this number should be higher.
Yep.
But like an employer is not going to care if there's like, well, I need to make more money because it's going to feel good for me personally. It's like, well, we all know that. Like that's very obvious.
Yeah.
Can you help us think through? So we've got some of the basics of negotiation. Can you help us think through some of the steps of negotiation? So as we're going into, we're interviewing, what do you advise candidates to be thinking about, or like what kind of homework do they need to do in advance of a compensation negotiation?
Yeah, there is a common misconception that you need to be so prepared on the market rate of the role you're applying for, and you do all this research. First of all, a lot of people do the research in some easy to find data such as levels.fyi or Blind or Glassdoor. Those are not good sources. It's good to have those data points, but they are self-reported data, so it's not very meaningful. You actually want to, if you have access to it, you want to have more data that's reported by the employers. Second of all, the reason why it shouldn't really matter why all the research that you do on compensation ties back to what I mentioned earlier, which is a company might have its own internal reasons why they could pay more. So again, they might have some deadline, or the team is short-staffed, or they want to impress like an investor or someone with a new hire. So the fact that there are internal reasons that we will never know, the market data is definitely a helpful point, but it's not the end all be all. On the other hand, the best way to prepare, not only if you have access to a good market data, it's usually paid, mostly only companies have access to it, and myself. And the better way to prepare is if you find people at the roles that you're applying for. So let's say you're applying for a product manager role, find a product manager at the same company, ideally, or at a similar company, and you just hop on a call and say, hey, I'm doing research on how much a PM gets paid at this type of company. I'm happy to share that data with you. Would you be willing to share as well? So I'm happy to share what I'm finding across the industry. Would you be able to share your data as well? I'll keep it confidential and things like that. That is one of the best data points for you to find a real data on how people are paid at those roles. I know it's a lot of work going out there and cold outreaching if you don't have the connections, but it is one of the most reliable ways to find out how much you should be paid.
Yeah, and my recommendation is to steer away from people at the company, like steer external to the company, because you are still in that interview process to get your research done.
On the other hand, it's a company like Meta where there's hundreds of thousands of employees. Again, yes, be very careful what you're doing during an interview stage. If it's just an informational, there's nothing wrong with you asking someone else if they're willing to share their comp. It's just doing your research, and there are no laws against it or anything like that. And people can proactively share. For example, I'm sure you know, in an MBA setting with classmates, we're always sharing how much we make at different companies. It only benefits us. But I do support what you said. Do be careful with, reaching out to people within the same company, especially if it's on the smaller side.
The other thing that you mentioned earlier in the conversation is having this priority list. And this gets at the idea that there are non-financial aspects of compensation negotiation. Can you talk a little bit about what some aspects are to even negotiate in the first place, and then how you advise candidates to make a priority list?
Yeah, so I actually have a document for this, and I'm happy to share with your audience in the links. Basically, things to think about are beyond total comp, which is base salary, annual bonus, sign-on bonus, equity, which takes the form of stock options or RSUs. And you think about title. You can think about whether you have direct reports or not. You can think about benefits like travel reimbursement, or, gym reimbursement, or, visiting the office if it's a remote role, like visiting the office every so often, or working remotely and things like that. So there's a lot to think about that. Again, many of these are very personal, like if your preference on work from home and things like that. The way I recommend people use this list to inform their negotiation strategy is, rank them in order of priority and then highlight the non-negotiables. And you want to start with the non-negotiables. If title is something you're willing to walk away from because of it, you want to open that conversation relatively early on. And that's one thing you can actually do at the verbal offer stage, for example. Just get a feel for the flexibility the company has with title. And then if it's pay, you want, then you go down the list. And then it's like, I want a sign-on bonus. And you mention sign-on bonus after negotiating salary, and go down the list one by one.
Awesome. That's super helpful. So you advise people to go in order of their own priorities down the list. So for folks that might never have experienced equity-based compensation, I want to linger here for a few minutes. Can you talk to us a little bit about equity-based compensation, how you think about equity-based comp, and how you advise your clients to think about equity-based comp?
Yeah, there's the two big divides into the equity compensation is it a public company? And so it's already a materialized type of compensation, or is it private? And so it's not very clear if it will ever materialize. And if it's still a private company, what stage is it in? So as we're going from the earlier stage, like pre-seed, seed, Series A, it's still very early to know whether that equity will materialize or not. And then if it's later stage, it's like right pre-IPO, then of course it's a bit more meaningful than the equity you're getting at a much earlier stage company. There are some people that think of equity almost as monopoly money, as they phrase it to me. I think it's actually an upside. The way I see it is, it might not pan out, but if it does, it could potentially be worth a lot. So there's a whole range of books you can read about this. It's something I can cover in the next couple of minutes, but do familiarize yourself with strike price and, what percentage of equity of the company makes sense for certain levels, and how to think about it. It's a whole industry to learn. But in general, the easier thing I can say is if you go into a public company, you have a good sense of how much your equity will be worth, or RSUs, or as we call it. And otherwise, with startups, there's obviously very high risk, but also potentially high return.
So equity-based comp is like a huge can of worms. We could talk about this for like 6 or 10 hours and not even cover nearly all of it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, equity-based comp is creating buy-in in the company's future, of course. We've already mentioned the difference between a publicly traded company versus a privately traded company. You should do a mental calculation about the likelihood of that equity to pay off in the future and your own personal risk tolerance. Gerta and I are both startup founders, so our risk tolerance may be higher or just different than someone else's. And most of the work that we do is for the equity value that we're creating as well.
Yes.
As founders, right?
Yeah, and one thing I was gonna mention is because equity is so hard to predict if it will materialize at a startup stage or pre-IPO stage, like employers will have an easier time giving you more equity rather than more cash, because cash is cash. Let's take an example of a startup at series, under C, anywhere between A and C. They have some cash, probably not infinite amounts. And so they want to give you a bit less cash than what a FANG company would give you, but they could give you more equity because that's the lever they have more power to work with. So that is also another thing to think about as I'm negotiating. The chances are I will get a lot more equity, but not as much cash. How much do I have faith in this company panning out if it's not public, like being successful? And would I prefer cash versus an increase in total comp versus an increase in equity alone? If you're thinking of equity just as monopoly money, then you actually want to ask specifically for more cash in your ask and in your negotiation, rather than an increase in total comp, because you'll be surprised how much more they can give you in equity when you didn't believe in it. But I would make sure you position it as, my needs right now are more around like cash needs, but I fully believe in the company's, success and future. Is just that right now my needs are such that I prefer a bit more cash rather than equity. So you also don't want to signal that you don't have faith in the company's future by asking for cash rather than equity.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, actually, it's interesting that you bring it up. I'm reading the book Burn Rate by Andy Dunn.
Mm-hmm.
Have you read the book?
I've read the first 10 pages, so you could say I'm an expert.
Perfect. I love that. Anyway, so the book is by the founder of Bonobos. It's a book about mental health, about the founder journey. It's pretty interesting. I do recommend it. So far, so good. I'm like halfway through. But he talks about a conversation that he had with Mark Lohr, who's the founder of Jet.com and Diapers.com. And the advice that Mark Lohr gave to him was that when he's negotiating with a candidate or trying to find the right candidate for a role, to always prefer the candidates. Mark used to make people two offers. He would make them one that was higher in cash and one that was lower in cash but higher in equity. Mm-hmm. And he would always tend to prefer picking the candidates that were more interested in the equity because they were like true believers in the cause. And so these are some of the like subtext for the conversation around equity as it pertains to like what your counterparty may be thinking. Mm-hmm. I just thought it was a kind of an interesting point. I'm not sure that I think, you can also see this in sales type roles, like folks that are like, man, I just want like bigger opportunity for commission and I'm less interested in whatever the base is. But if the commission structure is good, I'm going to make it rain for this company and I want to share in the upside. That is always like a positive signal to an employer as well. So an interesting point. I thought it made sense to bring up.
Yeah, and employers might make these types of assumptions based on your preference for which element in the compensation you choose and ask to get more of. That's why I highly recommend speaking over it. So if you do want more cash, again, you want to say, it's my current needs right now, my, family plans for this year are such that I need more cash, but I fully believe in the company, just in case they take that as a signal that you don't believe in the future as much. It also depends on your seniority. So the younger you are, the more appetite for risk. But obviously, as you move further up in your career, the risk profile changes. And so it's not all in vacuum. It's also depending on your seniority, what you prefer and ask more for.
For sure. I want to bring things home here, and I want to pause to give you an opportunity to tell us a little bit about the advice that you're providing to startup founders. So you're not just working with people on compensation negotiation; you're also working with startup founders. I'd be curious to hear a little bit about your work there.
Yeah, I work with startup founders, as you said. I also work with people on their negotiating contracts. So there's always contracts with vendors, customers, design partners, and things like that. But founders more specifically, I've been a founder 3 times, and I'm an advisor, including with Techstars currently. So founders actually go through a lot of negotiations, even if they probably might not realize. So it's you negotiate with your potential co-founders for equity or ownership or various timelines. You negotiate with investors, you negotiate with, potential customers, design partners, vendors. There's always negotiations. And of course, if you have an exit, you negotiate with the company that will buy you or do a merger. So yeah, I guess the most obvious advice is, even if you hadn't realized, you're actually negotiating all the time, and let alone with like job prospects or direct reports and things like that. So you're negotiating all the time. It is a core business skill to have, and try to really invest in it. It will pay off a lot. Many of the things we touched on apply, and some also don't apply, but many of the things we touched on apply, such as, always be nice and cordial and professional with everyone you're interacting with. It's good to have other offers, whether it's with investors or co-founders. Don't put yourself in a corner where you only have this one option, and whether you either take it or leave it, like expand your options. And I was going to say, I could write a whole book, and I'm actually writing a book on negotiations, which will cover founders as well. So there's a lot to cover there, but definitely invest in getting better at negotiations.
For sure. It's a critical business function, business skill set. I have one actually saved around that I have to bring up. The last thing, and I would be remiss if I didn't bring it up, is to never negotiate against yourself. Like it sounds like such obvious and stupid advice, but I wish we'd given it earlier. Is like, I have seen, and I've even done this to myself, like going into a negotiation, you're like, well, like, yeah, you're like, you basically, sometimes people will try and play the part of the counterparty and like negotiate against themselves. Do not do that. Let the other person negotiate on their own, and listen more than you speak is typically like great advice for business, for negotiations, for life in general.
Yeah. And if I can add to that, I've had clients say one of the ways in which they negotiate against themselves is, I don't want to advocate for a higher title or pay because the expectations might be higher and I might not be ready for it and things like that. And my advice is, if there is money on the table for you to take it, if there is a title on the table for you to take it, it's on the employer to guard their titles and their money if they don't believe you're a good fit. But if they do and they're willing to give it to you, just take it. Especially since if you don't do that, it happens all the time. You go into a company, you're like, okay, I took a lower title. And then you see people at higher titles and you're like, oh, they're doing the same job as me. Why did I not take the opportunities that were offered? So don't negotiate against yourself in that way. And there's many other ways we sabotage ourselves as well. Primarily by revealing information it may be best not to reveal.
Awesome. Gerta, thank you so much for coming on and educating the audience, for educating me personally. I really appreciate it. Where can people find out more and support your work?
Yeah, thanks so much. The best place is my website, yournegotiations.com. I got lucky with that URL. And otherwise on LinkedIn, on Twitter, on Instagram, but all of that is in my website. So I'll go there first, and I have many free resources in there as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today.